Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Monday, the 10th of June in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And in Brussels, I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, as EU voters boost their support for far-right candidates in France, Germany, Italy and beyond, we look at what it means for the bloc. Plus, French President Emmanuel Macron calls a snap legislative election in a bid to halt Marine Le Pen's advance.
And here in the UK, Labour U-turns on plans to reintroduce a tax-free pension limit as all the political parties finalise their manifestos. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Emmanuel Macron has called a snap legislative election in France after his party came a distant second to the far right in Sunday's European Parliament vote. Marine Le Pen's National Rally scored more than double the 14.6% attributed to the president's Renaissance Party. Speaking in an address to the nation after polls closed, Macron said the National Assembly election was a chance to determine France's future.
This is a serious and weighty decision, but above all, it is an act of trust. Confidence in you, my dear compatriots, in the ability of the French people to make the just choice for themselves and for future generations.
Emmanuel Macron speaking there. His position as president won't be affected by the vote. His party and their allies are currently the largest group in the French National Assembly, but don't hold a majority. Far-right parties also make gains elsewhere in Europe. In Germany, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Social Democrats recorded their worst ever EU Parliament result, falling to third place behind the far-right Alternative for Germany and the centre-right Christian Democrats. Meanwhile, in Italy, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's right-wing Brothers of Italy party won between 27 and 31% of the vote, compared with just 6% in 2019. Despite these results, the centrist alliance, which backed Ursula von der Leyen to become EU Commission President, maintained its majority, led by her European People's Party.
We won the European elections. We are by far the strongest party. We are the anchor of stability.
Ursula von der Leyen speaking at the European Parliament after the election result. She plans to begin talks with her allies in the Socialist and Democrats and centrist Renew groups on securing their support from today. The euro fell to its weakest level in nearly a month as markets parse the results from across Europe and assess the risks from the snap election in France. The currency weakened by as much as 0.4% against the dollar, retreating alongside French bond futures. Traders have also pared bets on further interest rate cuts from the European Central Bank after data out on Friday showed the US job market holding up better than expected.
Meanwhile, let's turn to Israel, where Benny Gantz has resigned from the emergency government and called for elections there. A centrist member of Israel's three-man war cabinet, Gantz criticised Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over his handling of the war against Hamas, saying that a true victory puts, quote, bringing home the hostages above political survival. His resignation announcement was postponed by a day after the Israeli military freed 4 hostages in an operation in central Gaza. More than 270 Palestinians were killed in the operation, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. Now, the Labour Party has scrapped plans to cap tax-free pensions gains, leaving them with even fewer paths to raise government revenue. The change comes as UK political parties finalise their election manifestos this week. Bloomberg's James Walcock has more.
There is an internal slogan in Labour HQ: no complacency. The party have a 20-point lead in the polls, 3 weeks ahead of an election, and yet they are actively trying to make themselves a smaller target by ditching difficult policies. Leader Keir Starmer has also ruled out raising income tax, corporation tax and VAT. The Conservatives, meanwhile, have the opposite problem. Former Defence Secretary Liam Fox says it's time to move on from party leader Rishi Sunak's early exit from D-Day commemorations.
He apologised. He said it was wrong. Let's get over it. People make misjudgments. Let's talk about what really matters. D-Day was talking about the security of Europe. There is a threat, and I think the most important thing is keeping our country safe.
The Tories' historically poor position in the polls means Liberal Democrats and Reform increasingly see a chance of becoming England's second largest party. Both announce economic policies later today. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
In business news, Apple's AI successes will be on display at its developer conference later as the tech giant tries to prove its cutting-edge credentials. Bloomberg has learnt that the company will lay out a suite of features that it calls Apple Intelligence. Its new push is expected to lead to new hardware, including a robot for domestic tasks, a revamp of Siri and camera-equipped AirPods. Stephen, good morning. You've been in Brussels today and over the weekend, and you were there Friday for us as well. So it's been a really busy weekend for you. The European election results, they've caused something of a shockwave in many parts of Europe. I mean, a push to the right, if not really a kind of landslide for far-right parties. How did these results, do you think, will they be seen in Brussels? How were they received last night?
Well, it was interesting watching the country-by-country projections rolling in, because it depended on when polls had closed, when we heard how the picture was shaping up. Germany was one of the earlier results or projections that we had yesterday in the European Parliament, and immediately it was very clear it was a very bad night for German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The AfD, despite the problems that they'd had in their campaign and the controversies that have surrounded that party, had still managed to increase their share of the vote reasonably significantly as well. But it was clearly bad news for Olaf Scholz. Then came the exit polls from France, showing in fact results that were not terribly far from what opinion polls had been projecting, but nonetheless putting Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance Party in a distant second to the party of Marine Le Pen, the National Rally, which came in with just under 32% of the vote. It was clearly a very bad night for Emmanuel Macron. Then we heard that he was going to make this national address, and this shock announcement of a legislative vote coming now at the end of this month, a first round and a second round on the 7th of July. It's worth pointing out that in other parts of the continent, things looked better for the incumbents. Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party did extremely well in Italy, as had been expected. Pedro Sanchez in Spain, his centre-left party held its position and its vote share in the elections there. So a contrasting picture from some, and certainly the overall picture from Europe, in fact, not dramatically changed for the centrist parties, but some big shocks, particularly in France and Germany.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Also, the interplay of the European elections with domestic politics. I mean, worth adding, of course, that the UK not voting. This is the first time, actually, the UK is not voting in these European elections, obviously post-Brexit. But very interesting, as you say, the shock decision then for Macron to call a domestic legislative election on the back of, supranational European results.
Yeah, these elections are often described as being second-order elections, where we do seem to see voters vote more towards the extremes than they do in the centre. So that made it even more interesting that Emmanuel Macron decided to make this decision to call these snap elections for later this month. Of course, Macron himself won't be affected by this. He'll still be president no matter how these elections go, but it sets up for what could be a very interesting battle for who will become the biggest party in the National Assembly. At the moment, Macron has allies are the biggest group in the Parliament, but they don't currently have a majority. Let's dig into some of the reaction in France this morning. We've got Bloomberg's Caroline Connan with us from Paris. Caroline, good morning. This is a big gamble for Emmanuel Macron. Why did he do it?
Some say it's a gamble, some say it's actually pretty audacious, because I was reading a quote from the former chief economist from the IMF, Olivier Blanchard. He says, well, if the National Rally gets a majority in the next French parliament, then you get 2 messy years in French politics, but you don't get Marine Le Pen in 2027. So perhaps that's what Macron is trying to do. The wake-up call he's been saying over the past few days before even these European elections, calling the French to wake up, to face these far-right, these demagogues, as he called them last night in his speech when he announced these snap elections. Clearly, there is a high risk if you look at the European elections results in France last night, because Jordan Bardella, the candidate of Marine Le Pen's party, got 32%. That's more than double the score of Renew Europe, the party of of Emmanuel Macron. And actually, interestingly, coming third, you got a comeback of the socialists with Raphael Glucksmann at around 14%. But clearly, this was seen as the only solution by many, including the Republicans, who have been supporting the fragile majority that Macron has got at the moment at the National Assembly.
Caroline, what would it mean for policy making in France if these European election results were replicated in the National Assembly, if Emmanuel Macron were to lose a big part of his majority?
You know, Stephen, the system for the legislative elections is obviously quite different because it's a two-round system. There was only one round for these European elections. And usually this two-round system puts the extremes, puts the far right at a disadvantage. So we'll see how this pans out for these legislative elections. It really depends on the kind of majority he is getting. Is he going to be able to form some alliances, perhaps with the Republicans again, like he did during the first part of this mandate since 2022? Or is it going to be a large majority of the far right? And then we have a so-called cohabitation, which means in France that the Prime Minister is from a party and the President is from a different party. As you know, this has happened 3 times under the Fifth Republic. So this could happen again. And clearly that would mean a clear shift of policy at the European and at the French level, away from trade deals, away from climate change, and perhaps more focused on the issues of migration, border policy, defence spending.
Caroline, you've brought up one of my favourite words in French politics, which is cohabitation, which covers good and bad relationships between parties, but certainly very interesting to watch how the rest of this campaign plays out. Caroline Conat in Paris, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Caroline, this is, of course, one part of the broader picture here in the European Union as to how this plays out from here. It's interesting if you do look at what happens next at an EU level, because that process will continue no matter what's happening in France. We are seeing those centrist parties, that alliance that backed Ursula von der Leyen, having the majority, which would normally allow them to move forward to be able to nominate or to support her in a second term as EU Commission President. But the nomination power does lie with European leaders, so it will have to be their choice to nominate Ursula von der Leyen for another term as European Commission President. The maths in the Parliament look good, so it does look like that they're going into these negotiations in a position of strength. That was certainly the message that we heard from Ursula von der Leyen last night, underlining, and actually when I spoke to Manfred Weber, who's the president of the European People's Party, he also made the point that they won the election. They gained seats, which actually was a very good performance for them in this as well. So they're going into a position now where they're going to start talks today with their partners, the Socialists and Democrats and the centrist Renew group as well, to draw up what I suppose their programme of support is, preparing for that European parliamentary vote, and then we'll have the leaders start to discuss who is they're going to put forward. Will it be Ursula von der Leyen, or could there be a surprise there as well? And those discussions will start at a dinner this day next week, an informal dinner where those discussions will start too. But lots of other interesting parts of this election to dig into as well.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I found it very interesting that Caroline Conat talked about how it was an audacious move by Emmanuel Macron. I mean, also quite a risky one. In terms of Ursula von der Leyen, though, perhaps the most recognisable face of European politics, outside of Europe, what chance is there that she will now continue in her role? What else might von der Leyen want to do in terms of the agenda that she will have, for Europe?
It looks good, and her party is very much pushing that she should be the name that goes forward to the European Parliament for a vote. But even though they do still have a majority, which is important, it's worth remembering the last time around there was also talks with the Greens about getting them on board. We spoke to one of the Greens' lead candidates last night as well, who told us that they would be open to discussions with Ursula von der Leyen and her party over supporting her in that vote in the European Parliament, but they would want to see, unsurprisingly, climate policies put centrally into the programme for the next 5 years for the European Commission. I put that to Manfred Weber, actually, who's the president of the EPP, and he said, actually, the Greens have some convincing to do on their side as well, because they haven't supported some of the key measures up until now as well. So there is some horse trading that's going to happen behind the scenes. There'd been a lot of talk before this election about how the Ursula von der Leyen might seek support from some of those further right parties as well, particularly in the European Conservative and Reformist groups. There was lots of talk around Ursula von der Leyen forming alliances with Giorgia Meloni's party as well. It doesn't look at this stage like that's going to be necessary, but all of that horse trading still has to play out, and we may see some parties switch groups as well. So the maths isn't entirely clear, but certainly the position from here looks good for them. Also, it's worth pointing out, Caroline, the number of politicians I spoke to last night who talked about having to reflect on what these results mean, this increase in far-right representation. What does it mean about what they're going to have to address? Looking at the opinion polls out of France yesterday after the European election vote as well, the question of immigration very high for voters, the question of inflation and purchasing power also very key as well. The environment, health systems falling down the list there of priorities for voters. That's going to be in the minds of politicians as they seek to assemble this governing coalition or this governing alliance from here on. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.